In a conversational discourse like philosophy, your authority as an author comes from the position that you take up in the ongoing philosophical conversation about the topic under discussion. But how do you break into an ongoing philosophical conversation? What are the strategies for doing that? In this video, I want to briefly describe 5 of them. One strategy, you could call it joining sides. So this is the classic non-confrontational approach to an essay. Students attempt to gain authority by joining sides with an established philosopher. In other words, they make no attempt to criticize the established philosopher. Instead, they raise objections solely for the purpose of reinforcing her view. So there are at least 3 ways that you can think of this strategy, or 3 versions of this strategy. One version, the student plays the role of the advocate. All she does is raise objections to the philosopher's view and show that the philosopher has resources to answer those objections. That's it. It's the simplest possible philosophy paper that you can write. In the slightly more ambitious version of joining sides, which we can call the launch pad, the student uses the author's work as a launching pad for her own original, albeit modest, contribution. So this small contribution can be something like an extension of the philosopher's argument, or an application of the argument to a new domain, or any other minor constructive move like that, where the student is doing something that the author has not herself done, that is nevertheless pretty modest and mostly is based on the target argument, which some other philosopher has written. Finally, we can call the most ambitious version of joining sides the savior. Here, the student once again teams up with an established philosopher, but she notes that the philosopher faces seemingly devastating objections. Effectively, the savior attempts to rescue a controversial view from the scrap heap of dead ideas. So that is the 3rd most ambitious version of joining sides. And in every version of joining sides, the student gets her authority by teaming up with and extending the influence of an established philosopher. The second strategy we can call picking a fight. With this strategy, the student confronts an established philosopher and tries to take his authority by undermining his argument. As Gaipa points out, from whom I took some of these strategies, this strategy evokes the story of David and Goliath, with the student playing the part of the underdog who steps up to challenge a giant. Like David, the student should remain humble and approach the task with care. That is, she should avoid grandiose pretensions of annihilating her opponent and instead carefully seek out a small weakness in his position that she can exploit. The student who successfully executes this strategy gets a major boost in authority by striking a blow against a giant. The 3rd strategy is the Peacemaker. On this strategy, the student takes the arguments of 2 or more philosophers on a single topic and shows that she can resolve their dispute by articulating a position that encompasses both of them. In other words, the student shows that the philosopher's disagreement is really just a misunderstanding, and their positions, properly understood, are in fact compatible. The 4th strategy is essentially the opposite of the Peacemaker. We call it the Warmonger. As the name indicates, instead of making peace, the warmonger enters a dispute with 2 or more philosophers and attempts to alienate everyone. In other words, the student attempts to show that the philosophers disagree because they're all wrong. So this strategy can end with the student articulating what she considers the correct view, but it can also be purely critical, a purely destructive strategy that just takes apart all of the views under discussion. So the warmonger is like picking a fight, only the student has multiple targets. Ultimately, however, she gets her authority by taking some established philosophers down a peg. The 5th and final strategy I call going full Socrates. With this strategy, the student approaches a philosophical argument or a dispute between 2 or more philosophers as an intellectually curious outsider. So instead of joining sides or picking a fight, she simply raises questions that further illuminate the issues at stake in the dispute, without herself ever advancing any claims. So like Socrates, she does not herself claim to know anything. Instead, she shows that if we pursue the arguments of the authors under discussion to their logical consequences, we find ourselves with more questions than answers. Going full Socrates, then, is a philosophically rich strategy because it shows that the author's seemingly simple arguments often owe us answers to much deeper questions that they have ignored for the sake of simplicity. On this strategy, then, An objection doesn't claim that some premise or conclusion is false. Instead, it shows that assessing the truth of some premise requires us to answer a deeper set of questions than the author acknowledges. So here the student gets her authority by recasting an important dispute in new terms.